The Senate chamber erupted as Karoline Leavitt stood her ground, voice unwavering while a senior official pointed her toward the exit. Cameras flashed. The Constitution clutched in her hand trembled, but not from fear. A golden cross glinted at her neck as she refused to back down. Moments earlier, she'd spoken a truth the chamber didn't want heard. Now she was being escorted out, not for breaking rules, but for breaking the silence. The injustice was immediate. The audience gasped. Was this democracy silencing dissent? The tension snapped tight, and right there, in the eye of the storm, a battle for truth began. It was a late afternoon session in the U.S. Senate, the kind where power walks in with a polished grin and hidden agendas. The chamber smelled faintly of old leather, polished, wood, and quiet ambition. Fluorescent light washed the room in a sterile glow, but all eyes were fixed on one corner, on a young woman in a navy blazer, her cross necklace resting just above her heart like a silent oath. Her heels echoed with purpose as she stepped forward, calm but charged. Karoline Leavitt didn't dress to impress. She dressed with intent, modest, firm, unshaken. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. Around her, the air was thick with the smugness of establishment power. Suits too expensive, ties too tight, smiles too fake. Men who spoke in circles and women who mirrored their strategy sat comfortably, sipping water as if their decisions didn't break lives. They whispered when she entered, not out of curiosity, but caution. This wasn't just a young woman with a mic. This was someone carrying legacy. Faith wasn't an accessory for her. It was her framework. Behind her eyes there was a weight that didn't come from ambition. It came from responsibility. She had been raised in a culture of conviction, not convenience. Her values were written in prayers, not polling data. And she wasn't here to blend in. She was here to speak up. The irony burned. Loud voices defending indecency were applauded, while her quiet clarity sparked discomfort. She noticed it, the way some glanced at her cross, then looked away. The way her references to tradition drew polite eye rolls from those who tolerated every voice but hers. Flashy agendas promoting chaos were cheered. But her calm defense of order, that was dangerous. Yet Karoline didn't shrink. She listened. She waited. She knew the storm would come, not because she was weak, but because she was unshakable. And what was at stake wasn't just a vote or a headline. It was the right to speak truth in a room that claimed to represent it. She wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for every voice that had been told to sit down. This wasn't politics. It was a battlefield dressed in decorum, and she had just stepped onto it, fully aware, fully ready. The Senate floor that day wasn't just another setting. For policy talk, it was a theater of tension, layered with hidden contempt and unspoken power plays. Ornate columns lined the chamber like silent judges. Velvet drapes cast heavy shadows over marble floors, as though history itself was watching. Every chair, every desk bore the scars of old decisions. It was a place built for debate but conditioned for control. The clock read 3:47 p.m., but the real time was reckoning. Karoline Leavitt entered not as a guest, but as a disruption. Her steps were steady, her posture unwavering like someone carrying a mission larger than herself. Her outfit was simple but striking. Navy blue, crisply tailored, no designer logos, no political lapel pins. Just a small silver cross that caught the light whenever she moved. It wasn't meant to provoke, but in this room it did. Her expression was focused. Not cold, not arrogant, just fiercely clear. She didn't walk like someone trying to fit. And she walked like someone who already knew she wouldn't. To the casual observer, she might have seemed young for such a place. Outnumbered, perhaps outmatched. But age couldn't hide the generational steel in her bloodline. Her family came from hard-earned values. Her grandfather served in World War II. Her father built with his hands what others only talked about. Her mother taught her that faith wasn't something you wore on Sundays, it was something you bled for on weekdays. Karoline didn't inherit privilege. She inherited purpose. And now here she stood, in a place that prided itself on tolerance. But only if you agreed. The room buzzed with opposing forces. On one end sat senators wrapped in layers of artificial charm and polished spin. Some scrolled through their phones. Others exchanged smirks. A few openly rolled their eyes the moment she was recognized to speak. They wore their tolerance like a mask, carefully stitched to hide contempt for anyone who dared bring a moral compass into a political forum. This was a place where outrageous rhetoric earned applause and cheap theatrics earned airtime. Where rainbow pins were celebrated but crosses were seen as a threat. Where legacy was mocked if it came from the wrong tradition. Karoline could feel it. Not just the eyes on her, but the judgment behind them. She didn't need to guess what they thought. She could see it in the way they adjusted their ties, in the half-laughs, the deliberate sighs. Her very presence, grounded in unapologetic truth, made them uncomfortable. And they weren't subtle about it. She wasn't naive. She knew the kind of war she had walked into. This wasn't about one bill, one argument, or one side of the aisle. It was about what kind of voice was allowed to survive in that chamber. And more specifically, which voices were politely destroyed before they ever reached a microphone. Karoline had watched the system up close before. She'd seen people with no beliefs rise faster than those with conviction. She had seen how character got you mocked, how faith got you labeled. She knew the cost of standing up in this room wasn't just political, it was personal. It could stain reputations, invite hit pieces, and trigger 1,000 social media grenades. But she also knew what silence cost, and she refused to pay that price. As she waited for her moment to speak, the atmosphere grew heavier. She glanced around the room and saw the full portrait of what was really at stake. It wasn't her political future. It was truth's right to be spoken aloud. There were school kids in small towns who still believed this building represented freedom. There were single mothers praying their voices mattered, veterans who saluted a flag that now hung behind lawmakers too cowardly to honor it. And Karoline, in this moment, wasn't just standing in a Senate chamber, she was standing for them. Across the room, a senator in an electric blue blazer laughed a little too loudly at a colleague's whispered joke. She had been celebrated for speeches on equity, praised for slogans that sounded good but solved nothing. She would never be kicked off the floor, no matter how outrageous her remarks. She was the kind of loud the system tolerated. But Karoline's quiet truth? That was too much. A staffer walked past Karoline, eyes flicking down at her cross, then quickly away. Another scribbled notes without listening. The media gallery above was full of reporters, most already halfway through their controversial "Conservative Sparks Outrage" headlines before she even opened her mouth. Cameras were ready, but so were the claws. This wasn't a place of neutral ground. It was a battlefield dressed in etiquette. Karoline wasn't invited to fight. She was expected to fold. But she didn't. Because for her, this wasn't about being liked or even heard. It was about standing in a place where truth had gone to die and daring to speak resurrection. And just before her name was called, as she inhaled slowly and stepped forward, there was a shift. Not in the room, but in the moment. A calm that settled not from confidence in herself, but confidence in something higher. She didn't believe she was alone. She never had. Her faith wasn't performance. It was presence. And in that quiet second before the storm hit, she stood taller. Not because she was unafraid, but because she knew the cost was worth it. Because if someone didn't speak now, the silence would never end. The moment Karoline Leavitt began to speak, the temperature in the room shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably. Her tone was clear, firm, and completely devoid of political theater. No fluff, no buzzwords, just plain-spoken truth, sharpened by courage and carried on conviction. She was referencing law, history, and precedent, nothing controversial unless you feared the Constitution. But that was enough. Within 60 seconds, she had stepped on sacred toes and rattled the polished cages of those who thought her kind of voice didn't belong here. The shift came fast, and then the antagonist stood up. Senator Graham Weller, the polished face of controlled opposition. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His entire career had been built on measured interruptions and strategic tone policing. He adjusted his cufflinks, took a deep breath, and rose as if called by duty. But it wasn't duty that moved him. It was discomfort. Karoline's words had struck something he and others had carefully kept buried. The idea that truth didn't care about seniority. "Ms. Leavitt, that's enough," Weller said, smiling like a fox just before it bites. "You're out of order." She paused, blinked once, then continued, calmly, as if nothing had happened. Weller's smile stiffened. "Ms. Leavitt," he repeated, "this chamber is not a place for emotional outbursts and ideological grandstanding." The room tensed. Cameras swiveled. Even some of his own colleagues raised their eyebrows, not because they disagreed but because they recognized the tactic. Silence someone without silencing them. Frame them as hysterical, disruptive, inappropriate. He wasn't addressing her arguments, he was discrediting her presence, but Karoline didn't break. She stood still, hands resting on the edge of the podium as if absorbing every jab, every glance, every effort to shrink her down to something manageable. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. The pause made people listen harder, made her next words land deeper. "I'm not here to grandstand," she finally said, voice steady. "I'm here to represent Americans whose voices are being dismissed the same way mine is right now." That's when the chamber cracked. Audible murmurs, a few gasps, a few claps, cut short by stern glares from those in power. And just like that, the lines were drawn. Weller's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, breaking the invisible code of Senate decorum by invading her space. "You've had your say," he hissed, this time without the performative courtesy. "Now sit down." But she didn't. She didn't raise her voice, didn't point fingers. She simply looked him in the eye and said, "No." That single word set the place ablaze. Other senators began to chime in. Some tried to cover for Weller. "Let's move on. We're not here for personal agendas. This isn't productive," but it was already too late. The bias was visible. The system had taken its mask off. Staffers and aides on the sides looked nervous. Journalists in the press gallery leaned forward. The live stream chat online exploded. You could see it now. This wasn't an accident. Karoline wasn't just being interrupted, she was being removed. A motion was filed within minutes, a formal request for her removal from the floor for breach of decorum. Weller didn't file it alone. 2 other establishment senators co-signed. Their faces flushed not with anger but exposure. They weren't fighting a speech, they were fighting a mirror, and Karoline's presence showed them exactly what they didn't want to see. Security was quietly summoned, not in full uniform, but in the tailored discretion reserved for high-profile embarrassments. One officer moved toward her with soft steps, clearly hoping she would take the hint and leave quietly. But she turned toward him and said, "Am I being forcibly removed for quoting the Constitution?" The entire room froze. You could feel it now, burning beneath the surface, a sense of disbelief. This was no longer just a debate. This was punishment. This was a system correcting someone who had dared to speak outside the script. And people noticed. From the intern sitting on the sidelines to a visiting school group in the balcony, eyes widened, phones came out, and whispers turned into furious typing. The imbalance was undeniable. Men who had yelled, cursed, and filibustered for hours had never been removed. But this woman, young, composed, and calm, was being escorted out like a threat. Karoline didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She didn't. As she gathered her notes and took one step back, she turned to the room and said, "History will remember this moment, not because I was silenced, but because you were afraid of what I had to say. It wasn't a speech. It was a verdict, and..." With that, the conflict burst into full flame. Outside the chamber, people began to gather. News broke mid-broadcast. X, formerly Twitter, lit up. Some cheered, others jeered, but all watched. The public spectacle had formed, not because Karoline had caused drama, but because she had exposed it. Inside, even those who had once smirked now looked uneasy. A few of the more honest senators stared down at their desks, suddenly unsure if They were on the right side of the moment. Staffers exchanged glances. The officer hesitated. And the public? They weren't just witnessing a debate. They were watching a truth-teller being punished in real time. Karoline walked out slowly, not in shame, but with a kind of dignity that made the entire expulsion feel like a ceremony of her own making. She didn't yell back. She didn't even look behind. Because this wasn't her defeat. It was the beginning of their unraveling. The conflict was no longer contained to four walls. It was loose, loud, and viral. And for the first time in a long time, the Senate floor looked less like a place of power and more like a place exposed. Karoline didn't storm out. She walked with intention, not retreat. Her removal from the Senate floor wasn't the end, it was the spark. And as soon as she stepped outside those chamber doors, the silence broke. Reporters flooded toward her. Phones thrust out. Microphones extended. But Karoline didn't flinch. She wasn't there to rant. She was there to reclaim something stolen, not just her voice, but the rights of every American watching. She paused at the podium, placed hastily in the marble hallway, surrounded by cameras and flashing lights. And then she spoke. Not emotionally, not with fire or vengeance, but with clarity and control. Her tone was level, her eyes locked forward. And what came next wasn't a defense. It was a declaration. What happened inside that chamber today, she began, wasn't about me. It was about a system that punishes truth when spoken plainly. I quoted the Constitution. I referenced federal precedent. I stood up for citizens who feel silenced, and I was removed for it. That is not democracy, that is fear, dressed in formality. She opened a binder, not for show, but for fact. In 1964, the Supreme Court ruled in New York Times Cumber v. Sullivan that public discourse, even if controversial, is protected under the First Amendment. I did not disrupt. I did not defame. I exercised a constitutional right, and for that I was forcibly removed. No yelling, no theatrics, just law. She flipped to another page. Senate Rule 99 governs decorum in the chamber. Nowhere in that rule does it state that quoting a founding document or citing relevant precedent is a violation. If those rules are being rewritten mid-session to suit comfort over truth, then we are no longer operating under a republic, but under a performance. The crowd began to murmur. This wasn't just a young woman defending herself. This was a citizen invoking the exact tools meant to protect the people from government abuse. She wasn't shielding herself with her identity. She was wielding it, sharpened by knowledge and rooted in faith. My removal wasn't personal, it was systemic, she continued. I represent millions of Americans who are tired of being told their values are outdated, their patriotism is offensive, and their faith is dangerous. Let me be clear. My allegiance is to God, to country, and to the Constitution, not to fragile egos in power suits. The media buzzed. Clips began circulating online in real time. Social media exploded with phrases like, "She brought receipts," and "Karoline's not backing down." Some of her critics tried spinning it, calling her dramatic, calling her naive. But their words sounded hollow against the weight of her calm conviction, and then she did what no one expected. She announced legal action. I have already instructed my legal team to file a formal complaint with the Senate Ethics Committee. Not for personal vengeance, but for precedent. No citizen should ever be removed from a public chamber for quoting the Constitution. If it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone, and we're not going to let that happen. The antagonist, Senator Weller, had left through a side door, avoiding cameras. His absence spoke louder than any statement. The authority he once projected had begun to crack. Not because Karoline shouted him down, but because she showed the world he had no legal ground to stand on. The audience felt it now, not just sympathy for her expulsion, but pride in her resolve, and it didn't stop with words. Within hours, her team published a legal memo online, outlining case law, Senate procedure violations, and First Amendment protections. It wasn't written in emotional language, it read like a legal bullet train, each section laid out with evidence. Every claim backed by precedent. This was no media stunt. It was a constitutional stand. Church leaders issued statements. Law, Professors weighed in. Legal experts on primetime news reluctantly admitted she was right. The removal wasn't just improper, it was unconstitutional. And the more they read her statement, the more they realized this wasn't a one-off incident. This was part of a pattern, a slow erosion of freedom dressed up as professionalism. By the evening, Karoline was trending across all platforms. But it wasn't for going viral. It was for standing legal ground. She didn't call for protest. She didn't call for outrage. She called for clarity. "This is not about sides," she said during an evening interview. "It's about principle. If truth is no longer allowed in our highest chambers of law, then truth has no home in this country. And I refuse to accept that." Her calm demeanor, her structured argument, her unshakable belief, it turned public perception. She wasn't just another headline. She became a measuring stick for integrity. She wasn't screaming into the void. She was holding a mirror to the system and forcing it to look. And perhaps the most powerful moment came not in front of a camera, but in a letter. The next morning, Karoline published an open letter addressed not to her critics, not to the Senate, but to the American people. In it, she wrote, "I walked onto that floor not to disrupt but to defend. I walked out not in defeat but in defiance of silence. The law is not a costume, it is a covenant. And when it's broken, the people must rise, not with rage but with resolve." That letter sealed it. The narrative shifted from controversy to clarity. This wasn't a media frenzy. It was a civic awakening. Karoline's moral and legal stand didn't just defend her moment, it redefined it. She didn't need to win the argument in that room. She won it in the hearts and minds of Americans watching. The antagonist's authority, once unquestioned, was now being questioned by the very system he thought protected him. And Karoline? She didn't just walk back into the debate. She walked into history as a citizen who turned her voice into a verdict. The tremors began, quietly, not with a shout, but with a shift in posture. Senator Weller, once towering with procedural authority, now seemed smaller behind his polished desk. His voice, once commanding, now cracked with forced composure. The cameras caught it. So did the crowd. He shuffled papers nervously, not because he needed them, but because his hands needed somewhere to go. The courtroom energy had changed, and everyone could feel it. The same gavel he had slammed to silence Karoline now felt like a toy in his hand. Each bang echoed not with dominance but desperation. It no longer hushed the crowd, it highlighted his unraveling grip. Senators who once nodded along now exchanged glances, their expressions shaded with discomfort. Staffers looked down. Clerks typed slower. Bailiffs stood a bit looser, no longer statues guarding the gate but humans witnessing a turning tide. Karoline had not returned to the chamber alone. She walked back in surrounded by constitutional lawyers, grassroots supporters, and a viral movement that had already exposed the fragility of Weller's power. She didn't interrupt. She simply took her seat, calm, resolute, radiant in quiet authority. And for the first time it was Weller who looked like the disruptor. His accusations rang hollow. His appeals to decorum felt performative. The law was no longer on his side. It was against him. He attempted to regain control. "Ms. Leavitt, this chamber has rules." But before he could finish, Karoline raised one hand, not to silence him, but to request recognition under procedural order. The move was surgical, legal, and perfectly timed. "Point of order, Mr. Chair," she said clearly. "I have here the specific clauses from Senate Rule 99, as well as the First and 14th Amendments, which protect my right to speak as an elected representative. I move to strike your prior objection as a violation of my constitutional rights." The room froze. This wasn't rebellion, it was legal procedure. On the record. Undeniable. Senator Weller blinked rapidly, stammering. You can't just," but Karoline continued. "Furthermore, I have filed a formal grievance with the Senate Ethics Committee, citing procedural abuse, unlawful expulsion, and personal misconduct under color of authority. I have also notified the Office of Senate Legal Counsel." A ripple, moved through the room. The legal clock had started ticking, and it wasn't on Weller's time anymore. Outside, the pressure had grown volcanic. X, formerly Twitter, was ablaze. Hashtags like "Our Karoline kicked back" and "Our constitutional comeback" trended worldwide. Prominent figures, lawyers, influencers, journalists, and even senators publicly voiced support. One commentator on a primetime news show said, "What Weller did wasn't just procedural overreach, it was political suicide." Inside, you could feel the cracks deepening. Senator Weller glanced toward his aides, silently pleading for notes or guidance. But no one moved. His authority had become a liability, and now even his own staff was hesitant to be seen propping him up. Karoline stood again, calm, confident, and grounded. "Mr. Chair, I would like to read a brief passage not for provocation, but for precedent." Weller tried to stop her. "You are out of—" But his voice was drowned not by Karoline's but by the crowd in the gallery. Someone stood and clapped. Then another, and another. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. The people were speaking. Their applause wasn't loud, but it was unified. A slow, steady rhythm of support. Unstoppable. Weller slumped slightly in his seat. Karoline began reading. "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." She didn't need to finish. The message was complete. Suddenly, one of the clerks, the same one who had looked down earlier, stood and handed a document to a junior senator across the aisle. A motion, a quiet call to censure. Whispers began to circle. Conversations happened behind hands and under breath. The power dynamic had flipped, and the system had begun turning against its abuser. Weller attempted one final move. "I will have order in this chamber," he shouted, slamming the gavel. But this time, the gavel cracked. The wooden handle slightly splintering, symbolic and literal. The sound wasn't authority. It was collapse, and everyone heard it. A voice from the back, another senator, stood. "Mr. Chair, with all due respect, I motion to suspend your authority pending an internal review." Silence. It was over. Weller's jaw tightened. His eyes darted. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he slowly lowered the gavel to the desk. His fingers trembled as he released it. The once mighty figure had become a man, with no footing, dignity eroded, credibility shattered. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply returned to her seat and opened her binder again. She had come for justice, not revenge. Across the room, more senators nodded toward her, not out of political obligation, but out of respect. She had faced a system built to silence dissent, and she hadn't just survived it, she exposed it. Not with chaos, but with calm courage. The cameras captured Weller as he slowly rose and left the chamber. No aides followed, no applause accompanied. No reporters rushed to greet him. He exited not as a leader, but as a lesson, and in his place, Karoline remained seated, composed, and backed by the Constitution itself. Later that evening, political analysts would describe the moment as a turning point, a symbolic breakdown of performative power, and a return to principle. Social media users simply called it what it was: the moment truth stood taller than title. The antagonist hadn't just lost a debate, he had lost the trust of a nation, undone not by volume but by virtue. His collapse wasn't orchestrated, it was inevitable. And at the center of that fall stood Karoline Leavitt, unmoved, unbroken, and unmistakably victorious. It didn't take hours. It didn't even take minutes. The moment Karoline Leavitt reclaimed her seat and the gavel clattered in defeat, the outside world lit up like a firestorm. Within seconds, footage of the confrontation, grainy cell phone captures, professional news clips, and zoomed-in snapshots flooded every corner of the internet. What happened inside that chamber was no longer just Senate business. It was a national awakening. The first hashtag hit like a lightning strike. Karoline kicked back. Then came "Gavel Down, Our Constitution Queen," and she stood we stand. X, formerly. Twitter turned into a battleground of opinions, tributes, and side-by-side comparisons of Weller's collapse and Karoline's unwavering gaze. Influencers from across the spectrum, left, right, center, shared the clip, some with admiration, some with stunned silence. No one could look away. News networks rushed to cover the scene. Fox News aired the moment on repeat, calling it a constitutional reckoning in real time. CNN ran segments analyzing Karoline's legal citations word for word. Even international outlets picked it up. The BBC called her stand a modern American moment. Al Jazeera dubbed it the viral storm from the Senate floor. The headlines weren't just about politics, they were about power, and how a single voice turned the tables, and then came the Trump comment. On Truth Social, the former president posted in all caps, "Karoline Leavitt, American Lionheart. She didn't just speak, she stood. Total respect." That post alone got millions of interactions. Other conservative leaders chimed in, praising her as the future, a fearless patriot, and a symbol of the America that still fights. Even critics trying to spin the moment as political theater found themselves drowned out by the tidal wave of support. Their posts were ratioed into oblivion. Outside the Senate building, the streets filled, not in protest, but in solidarity. People brought mini constitutions. Some carried homemade signs. She read, "We rise." Others simply stood quietly, holding candles or phones in the air, playing the clip on loop. It wasn't just viral, it was visceral. Memes flooded the digital world. One had Karoline photoshopped standing tall with the Constitution in her hand like a sword, cutting through red tape. Another showed Senator Weller's broken gavel with the caption, "When lies meet law." T-shirts were printed before the sunset. TikToks turned her speech into remixed anthems and cinematic edits. It was no longer just a political moment. It was a cultural phenomenon. Students in law schools began discussing her argument in class. Professors cited it as a textbook example of real-time constitutional defense. Podcasters broke it down frame by frame. The virality wasn't superficial. It was substance that cut deep. Karoline didn't just trend, she transcended the noise. Meanwhile, donations to grassroots organizations spiked. Emails flooded inboxes of congressional offices, some in outrage, but many in gratitude. Voters who'd felt unheard found new hope. Young women, especially, took to social media declaring, "If Karoline can stand like that, so can we." It wasn't hero worship. It was inspiration that bred movement. The energy had gone far beyond screens. Churches mentioned her courage in Sunday sermons. Veterans shared posts calling her a daughter of liberty. Even comedians picked it up, not to mock, but to marvel. One late-night host said, "You know the moment is big when even Congress gets cinematic." And in all of it, Karoline stayed mostly silent. No victory lap, no media tour. Just one simple message posted to her official account. "I stood for the Constitution. Thank you for standing with me." 7 words, one thunderstorm. By midnight, political analysts were no longer talking about a chamber disruption. They were talking about a shift, one that couldn't be undone. Commentators called it a ripple that turned into a wave, a viral revival of principle over politics, and the day the gavel fell on its wielder. This wasn't a trending topic that would die by morning. It had etched itself into the public conscience. The footage would live on in documentaries, on classroom projectors, and in the hearts of every American who ever wondered if one voice could still make a difference. Because this wasn't fiction, it too was cultural memory in real time. The chamber fell into silence. The arguments, the fire, the spectacle, all of it faded. Karoline Leavitt stood alone, not shaken, but certain. She didn't need to say more. Her truth had already shattered the illusion. With the Constitution in hand and the weight of history on her shoulders, she turned and walked slowly down the aisle. Above her, light from the Capitol dome painted her silhouette in gold. It wasn't dramatic. It was poetic. She wasn't performing. She was finishing a battle that wasn't supposed to be hers to win, but she did. Outside, the crowd waited, not for noise but for the symbol. And when Karoline stepped out, they saw it. No chant, no speech, just reverence. A child waved a flag, a veteran saluted, and a young girl whispered, "That's who I want to be." Karoline didn't smile or wave. She placed her hand over her heart and looked up at the American flag. That image burned into memory, not because it was loud, but because it was true. She didn't stand for power, she stood for principle, and that made all the difference. Some walk into history for glory. She walked into it because it was right.